In this week's news, Motorola and OnePlus released their 2015 flagships. You can now use Google Now to dictate WhatsApp messages, and Microsoft officially launches Windows 10.
All this and more on episode 4 this week. Welcome to Bandwidth Blog On Air.
Welcome to Bandwidth Blog On Air, the weekly podcast of bandwidthblog.com. In recent news, Motorola have launched not one, but 3 new smartphones. Tell us more about it, Theunis.
That's right, Brian. Last week saw the launch of the Moto G 2015 edition, the Moto X Style, and the Moto X Play. Now, these are very interesting devices. Motorola have had big success with the Moto X and the Moto G in the past, with the Moto G being their best-selling phone in history. And they are hoping that this mid-range device will sell just as well again. Just to quickly run through the specs, the Moto G has a 5-inch 720p display. It's got a Snapdragon 410 quad-core clocked at 1.4 gigahertz. And it comes in 2 variants. The variant with 1 gigabyte of RAM has 8 gigabytes of storage, but then you can also get one with 2 gigabytes of RAM, which has 16 gigs of storage. It also has a 2,500 milliamp hour battery and a 13 megapixel main camera. Now, we're expecting big things for this device, but it is starting to become a little bit pricey if you look at the market it's aimed at. And then other than that, Motorola split their Moto X into 2 different devices in 2015. They've got the Moto X Play, which is slotting in, I would say, in between the Moto G and the Moto X Style, which is at the top end. And the Moto X Style has a Snapdragon 808 processor, which is, of course, that same 6-core processor we saw in the LG G4. It's got 3 gigabytes of RAM, a new 20.7 megapixel camera, and it has a 5.7-inch Quad HD display.
So what's the play here by Motorola? Because typically we've always seen the more high-end Moto X, and then there's the Moto G, which is sort of been always Motorola's more mid-range smartphone. But now there's the Moto X Play in between both of them. So what is Motorola's game here?
Well, yes, the Moto X Style is now taking the place of what was just called the Moto X as the flagship. And now the Moto X Play is coming in for those people that don't really want a phablet. The Moto X Style has a 5.7-inch display, whereas the Moto X Play has a 5.5-inch Full HD 1080p display instead of that Quad HD display. So it's not completely a flagship as we have with the Moto X Style. And it also has a slightly downgraded, I would say, processor with a Snapdragon 615 instead of that 808. So I think this device is aimed at people that want a very, very capable phone, but don't want a phablet-sized device, really. Motorola isn't the only company that launched their new flagship last week. OnePlus did as well.
Yes, now the dark horse in the room is the OnePlus 2, which is the sequel to OnePlus's prior flagship, the OnePlus One. And I'll brace yourself because these names are about to get terribly confusing. But the OnePlus 2 is continuing the trend of being a really affordable flagship smartphone with premium specifications. It's arriving with a Snapdragon 810 chip, 4 gigabits of RAM, 3,300 milliamp per hour battery, a 5.5-inch screen with a 1080p display, and above and beyond that, it comes armed with USB Type-C, and it's one of the very first Android flagship phones to do so.
Well, you said that OnePlus is synonymous with making flagships at an affordable price. Do you know if it's ever going to come to South Africa, and if it does, what the price would be? Because as far as I know, it probably won't. They're still going to use their invite system. Can you tell us more about that?
Unfortunately, on that front, we've heard absolutely nothing. But what I can tell you is that the OnePlus 2 is going to be priced at a pretty reasonable $389. And in equivalent terms, that's about 5,000 South African rand minus import tax, etc., etc., which still retains a really, really affordable price tag. I think it would be something that a lot of South African customers would really be interested in if OnePlus were ever decided to bring their smartphones to South Africa.
Well, I actually think it's a really interesting device, and it would be great to see it in South Africa. But I am wondering, Brian, what are they going to do with the numbering of this phone? Because just the name OnePlus is confusing in the first place, and then the first phone was called One. Well, in my mind, and forgive me for being a real nerd here, I think that since we saw the launch of the OnePlus 2 now, that was preempted with the OnePlus One. So the OnePlus One gave us 2, which means the next one should be a 3. It means that the next one will have to be a OnePlus 5 because of the Fibonacci numbers. I wonder if they'll actually do that. I don't think so, but I think it would be quite funny.
I think that would probably be the most technical marketing plan of all time.
In other news, we all like our virtual assistants, and it seems that Google Now has had an interesting update.
Well, recent news is that you are now able to use Google Now to dictate WhatsApp messages. And this brings to Android a feature that's been with Cortana and Siri for a little while now, is that you can dictate text messages to your contacts in your phone. But more importantly, what this represents is it's a new phase of Google Now on tap, where Google is actively adding features from the most popular third-party developers' apps into Google Now's architecture. So we've already seen at the start of this year, we saw 50 third-party apps integrated into Google Now. Some of the big names like, I've got no idea if I'm saying this right, if it's Wunderlist or Wunderlist. But either way, that's been integrated there, so you can now use that service as your reminders client in Google Now. It seems like Google's really trying to push Now as the service which is going to be the epicenter of your phone.
What do you think is the potential of Google Now on tap? I mean, it seems like such a intuitive feature to have in your software, and it's interesting that it's only coming in now, and nobody else has done it really. Do you think the implementation thereof is quite difficult? Do you think it's about getting the third-party companies interested? Why are we only seeing it now?
Well, in many ways, let's just talk about Apple for a second, because Apple have always been likened to creating this beautiful walled garden in which things integrate and communicate effectively. And I think Google have sort of taken maybe a little bit of inspiration for this approach, but they've done it in a very novel way, which is integrating the most popular services and apps people use into their own architecture, that is the Android ecosystem. And what they're doing there is that I think they are seeking new ways to make Android more accessible and interesting to use. And really, the potential with third-party apps is quite limitless. I mean, anything that's on the App Store could potentially now be integrated into Google Now. I think what we're going to see now is almost a second wave of Android customization, where people are going to be able to configure Google Now to work exactly the way they want. And that's not something you can really do with Siri or Cortana. And it's something that really, I think, speaks to the openness and customizability of Android itself as a platform.
I think with Google Now, we already saw a massive step forward in terms of these virtual assistants, because it gave you much more functionality than I'd say something like Siri does, because it does integrate better with something like Chrome and then the rest of the Android ecosystem. I really think that it's an exciting next step for Google Now and for Google as a whole. They've got all this data now from their billions of users on Android phones. So I'm really looking forward to see where we go from here.
Now, talking of next steps, after much anticipation, Microsoft has finally unveiled Windows 10 to the general public, and you can now update your PC to run Microsoft's next-gen OS. What are your thoughts on Windows 10, Theunis?
Yes, well, we installed it last week. I think it came out on Wednesday, and it was about a 6 gigabyte download. And it installed very, very quickly, very easily. I think the whole setup process was very simple. And my first impressions are very, very positive. I think it's a great combination of the best of Windows 7, which it seems that almost everybody loved, and Windows 8's more touch-focused features, which people weren't too keen on a PC with a Metro theme. So I think it's a very good compromise between those two operating systems. I think it runs very well. I've actually installed it on a machine that has quite old software, and sometimes in the past we've seen that Windows isn't that great when upgrading on older hardware, like we saw with Vista. So it's so far it's a really, really good experience. We've only been using it for about 3 or 4 days, but I'm sure we'll delve into much more detail in the days to come.
Well, there are two things that I'm super ecstatic about. The first is how powerful Cortana's search function is throughout the OS. It almost makes searching for files a thing of the past. And secondly, Microsoft have really paid attention to detail in refining the better elements of the desktop. So all now the system icons are all in a uniform format. The Action Center is fantastic. And the Start menu, thank God it's back, is much better with those live tiles. And it really conveniently shows you the most pertinent information or the most recent information that you're likely to need. What I am interested in, though, which I found, I'm running Windows 10 now in a boot camp installation on the other side of my own MacBook Pro. And what I am interested in is running it in tablet mode. It runs it in a more of a 4x3 form factor as seen in Microsoft's recently launched Surface 3. And I find that interesting because it says something about where tablets might go, because previously we've always seen Windows 8 tablets in sort of a 16:9 form factor. And this might change things up. We've seen Microsoft themselves now release a square tablet, which they claim is better for productivity work, especially work in Microsoft Office. What are your thoughts on that, Theunis?
I think it does say something about where Microsoft wants to take their software, and perhaps even more importantly, where they're going to take their hardware. They are going to focus a lot on mobile, as they've said for the last couple of years. Unfortunately, we don't have Windows 10 for smartphones and tablets yet. We're expecting that closer to the end of the year. But I think it is a clue as to what Microsoft wants to do with their mobile devices and with the software on those mobile devices. I think it just shows us that they are thinking about the longer game, that they want to make this ecosystem something that can be used across any hardware. So they're even going to push it to Xbox, which is also interesting. I think Microsoft are thinking long game in terms of unification and simplification.
Review Spotlight, where we discuss our thoughts on the latest review devices to reach our hands. Well, carrying on from our conversation last week in episode 3, Theunis, you had the Huawei P8 in your hand. How's it been going in terms of software functionality? Are you still having reservations about the more iOS-style skin?
Well, yes, my thoughts on that hasn't changed drastically. I'm still not a huge fan of forcing you to have all of your apps on the home page, but what I've done since then is basically group them all together like I want to use them into many folders. And while I was doing that, I noticed that there was so much stock apps that Huawei have put on their phone, which I think is not really very useful, and it just takes up a hell of a lot of space. The size of those apps are quite large, and I've got the 16 gigabyte model. So I would have preferred if they weren't on the phone. But in terms of performance, the software is really proving to be a juggernaut. We have had some reports of the Mate 7, their previous flagship model, really slowing down and not doing much in terms of software optimization to help that. I haven't found those problems on the P8 as of yet, but I am trying to kill it as much as possible to see when it will bend or break. But luckily, thus far, it hasn't happened. Well, this is quite a Huawei-laden episode, it seems, in our review spotlight. But you are using the Huawei TalkBand B2.
Now, a snappy name this is not, but I am actually thoroughly enjoying the TalkBand B2 as a sports and fitness device, and sort of secondarily as an earpiece, and I'll get to that in a moment. But one of the things which startled me in sort of doing research about the product before it got on my desk was one very popular source cited the original TalkBand as the worst fitness band ever made. And I thought, that's quite a statement to make. So I opened the TalkBand B2 up with some amount of cynicism. And to be honest with you, I haven't found any inclination of poor performance at all. The TalkBand B2 is simultaneously, it's a fitness tracker and an earpiece. And what it does is it tracks your sleep hours, your calories burned, your steps taken, and the central piece detaches from the watch to function in-ear as a Bluetooth headpiece.
Tell us a little bit about the call quality of that earpiece. I think it's quite a unique feature that other products of this type don't really have. And also, what software is it running?
Well, first off, the TalkBand B2 runs its own proprietary OS, which is unique to the product. And generally, call quality I've been quite impressed with. It's simultaneously loud, crisp, and clear. And I'm very much enjoying it both as a Bluetooth headset and a fitness band. The one thing which does perturb me is that it doesn't fit snugly in the ear. Now, in the back of the central piece to the watch, which is the Bluetooth headset, it has a small sort of earphone loudspeaker, which doesn't sit comfortably in ear at all. It basically balances on the cusp of your ear. So if you shake your head around a good deal, it's bound to go flying, which I find slightly perturbing. If I spend this amount of money on the watch, I definitely wouldn't want to lose the central and most important piece. And when you unclip it, it does come off with quite a force, so expect it to eject like something out of a James Bond movie. But overall, I found it to be an accurate product, which compared to the Jawbone Up 24, which I own myself, I found quite accurate and quite enjoyable. Well, that's all for this episode of Bandwidth Blog On Air. Thank you very much for listening. Be sure to enter our AG Mobile Ghost giveaway running till the end of this week on bandwidthblog.com.
Thank you very much for tuning in, and be sure to join us next week for episode 5 of Bandwidth Blog On Air.
You've been listening to Bandwidth Blog On Air, the weekly podcast of bandwidthblog.com.